We're down to our final two teams in the 2019 Stanley Cup Playoffs. Representing the Western Conference, we have the St. Louis Blues, and representing the Eastern Conference, we have the Boston Bruins. So there is no doubt that the Boston Bruins are a heavy favorite in this Stanley Cup Final, and the Blues, they are a big underdog. The country seems to be rooting for the Blues, while mostly the East Coast is rooting for the Bruins. So, Johnny Talk Sports here to bring you my Stanley Cup Final preview and prediction. So let's get right to it. The St. Louis Blues, they've been through a lot this season. They fired their head coach at the beginning of the season. They switched goalies. Ever since Jordan Binnington has taken over, the St. Louis Blues have looked like a much different team with him between the pipes. In fact, Binnington has a .914 save percentage throughout the Stanley Cup playoffs, including one shutout. On the other side, though, with the Boston Bruins, Tuukka Rask has done a little bit better than Binnington has. Tuukka Rask has a .942 save percentage and two shutouts in these Stanley Cup playoffs. So that's going to be a huge factor with which team is going to win this Stanley Cup final. You're going to need your goalies to step up. For the Blues, you've got to get shots on Tuukka Rask. Because Tuukka Rask, the Bruins have the advantage with having the statistical better goaltender. And plus the Bruins, they have some Stanley Cup final experience. Even though it's been quite some time, it's been maybe about possibly 6-7 years ever since the Boston Bruins were last in the Stanley Cup final. They still have that experience. And the Bruins, they had a chance to force a Game 7 against the Blackhawks. Within the Blackhawks, they scored two quick goals to win Game 6 and clinch the Stanley Cup final that year. So the Bruins, they are looking for redemption. It's a 6-7 year long redemption course for the Boston Bruins. And the Bruins are hungry. The Blues are also hungry because they want to get a Stanley Cup championship for that franchise, for the city of St. Louis. They have come so close yet so far away from reaching the Stanley Cup final in recent years, and they're finally here. So both these teams are hungry to hoist the Stanley Cup. It's a best-of-7 series. Who's going to win? So let's talk about some of the players on each side that have stepped up. Jaden Schwartz for the Bruins, 12 goals and 4 assists. Your best point getter for the Blues. You have Vladimir Tarasenko, who has 8 goals in the Stanley Cup playoffs. David Perron with 6 goals. And you've got your 2 assist leaders in Ryan O'Reilly and Alex Pietrangelo with 11 assists apiece. And for the Bruins, they look more stacked on paper. It looks more split between like spreading around stats and points. You have Brad Marchand, who really the fans of the NHL don't like unless you're a Bruins fan. 7 goals, 11 assists. David Pastrnak, 7 goals, 8 assists. Patrice Bergeron, 8 goals. David Krejci, 4 goals, 10 assists. And Torrey Krug, 11 assists. Which is your tied for Brad Marchand as your assist leader. So the way I look at this, Marchand, Krejci, and Krug, all three of those have 10 assists or more throughout these playoffs. And the way I see this game going along is the Bruins, since they swept the Hurricanes. Well, let's just recap how both teams got here. The Blues, they made quicker work of the Winnipeg Jets in round 1. The Boston Bruins, they took the Maple Leafs all the way to 7 games. And they were able to pull that off. The Blues, they then were able to win against the Dallas Stars. And that was an epic game in overtime where the Blues, they pulled it out to move on and advance. Then the Blues, they got a little bit, they could have probably clinched their berth in the Stanley Cup final a bit earlier, but there was an argument of possibly a debate on some calls that benefited the Sharks. But that doesn't matter because the Blues are right where they're at. And the Bruins, in the second round, they were down 2-1 against the Columbus Blue Jackets. And ever since then, they have just dominated. They won 3 in a row against the Blue Jackets after falling behind 2-1. And they were able to sweep the Carolina Hurricanes 4-0. So the Bruins, they're going to have a little bit extra rest once the puck drop for Game 1 begins over the St. Louis Blues. And here's how I see this series playing out. I think Game 1 is going to go to the Bruins because home ice and you have more rest than the St. Louis Blues do. Game 2, I think will also go to the Bruins. So I think the Bruins are going to protect home ice throughout the first 2 games. Going to St. Louis for Game 3, I think the Bruins are going to have a 2-0 series lead. Then I think Game 3 is going to go to the Blues. I think Jordan Binnington is going to possibly only allow 1 goal. This could be an ideal game where the Blues end up winning 2-1 in overtime. Game 4, I think, is going to go to the Bruins. So I think the Bruins, they're heading back to Boston in Game 5 on their home ice with a 3-1 lead. And in Game 5, I think the Bruins are going to clinch the Stanley Cup Final in Boston. I'm going to say the Bruins in 5. And I think throughout this series, I think that the Boston Bruins defense is going to be too much for the Blues to handle. The Boston Bruins just look too stacked. The Boston Bruins were the second favorite to win the Stanley Cup behind the Tampa Bay Lightning, but once the Lightning got eliminated in round 1, the Bruins, they turned in to be the favorite, and I think that the favorite is going to prevail here. Although everyone seems to be rooting for the Blues except for everyone on the East Coast, particularly in Boston, I think the Bruins are going to win in 5. I just think the defense is just too stacked for Boston. I just think the Bruins are just too stacked. I think the Bruins, they just have more depth than the Blues do. So I think the Bruins are going to win it in 5. So that's my prediction. Leave your Stanley Cup final prediction down below. Also like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.